RPG Heroes, a podcast where every other week I speak to a true hero in the realm of role-playing games about their journey, their craft, and their views. As your host, I will focus on one particular aspect of this wonderful hobby for the interview, regale you with stories from my own 25 years of experience with role-playing games, and reflect on the major takeaways from the interview. Join me now on this epic journey and awaken the hero in you. Welcome to episode 10 of RPG Heroes, where we're going to delve into our main topic of post-apocalyptic role-playing games. And today we're going to be talking to Tomas Härenstam. He is the creator of Mutant Year Zero, which is an award-winning role-playing game that has become the basis for many other cool games that his company Fria Ligan, or in Swedish Fria Ligan, has published since. We're going to unpack the post-apocalyptic genre. We're going to talk about European games versus American games. We're going to talk about why he uses D6 dice pools. And of course, in general, I'm going to talk on my own about my experiences with post-apocalyptic role-playing. Before we dive into all that juicy stuff, though, let's talk a little bit about the podcast in general. The giveaway competition that I ran over on Twitter has finished, and I would like to congratulate Bert for winning a lovely drive-through RPG voucher. It was a cheap one for me since there weren't many other people participating. That's okay. I hope that Bert enjoys his purchase, whatever he is going to buy. From what he told me, he was looking at a bundle of role-playing games intended for using with his kids, which I think is just absolutely awesome. Also, on the Patreon front, the group of patrons is growing, and we decided to meet up on a video call, which is happening soon. It's happening towards the end of May. So, for those of you who are still thinking about joining my Patreon, well, if you hurry up, you're going to have a video chat with me and the other patrons towards the end of May. So, join us. And just as a quick teaser, I did a very interesting collaboration with fellow podcasters from overseas in the United States, which I cannot tell you too much about, but you'll see when it happens. All right, now let's end the world and enjoy what happens after. So let's start with what is post-apocalyptic fiction in general. And I'm going to be honest, I'm using the help of Wikipedia a bit here. And I'll link to the full article, of course, in the show notes. So post-apocalyptic fiction is a subgenre of fiction in which the world's technological civilization has collapsed due to an apocalypse event. And the apocalypse event itself may be related to the climate, it could be astronomical, such as an impact of an asteroid, it could be destructive, like a nuclear holocaust or resource depletion, it could be medical, such as a pandemic, #too soon. It could be eschatological, such as the Last Judgment, the Second Coming, or Ragnarok. Or it could be more imaginative, such as a zombie apocalypse, which has been done a lot in fiction, a cybernetic revolt, technological singularity, dysgenics, or an alien invasion. Whatever the case may be, the world is ruined, civilization has crumbled, and technology is gone, or at least difficult to get to. The time that you're going to play this game in could be right after the actual catastrophe, which will probably then zoom in on the psychology of the survivors and having to find a way to maintain the human race alive and together as one. Or it could be considerably later, which usually means that we have kind of start to mythologize the pre-catastrophe civilization as gods or superior beings, or at least as something that can only really exist in our imaginations. And a very important aspect of post-apocalyptic fiction and role-playing games often is trying to find out A, what happened, what was the apocalyptic event, and B, trying to gather all these little bits of technology and things that we want in order to survive and that we need in order to survive. Something even as simple as water and food and electricity, or at least warmth. You could, of course, also opt to have the apocalypse event happen during your game and have players deal with that and then the fallout as part of your campaign. And this is something I actually did in a Cyberpunk 2020 campaign that I ran years ago. And it started as a normal Cyberpunk 2020 campaign, so dystopian future, lots of high tech, etc. And suddenly aliens invaded, really messed up the world, and then the characters had to survive in this post-apocalyptic landscape. It was a real twist in the regular expectations of a cyberpunk game for the players, and that met with partial success. So the players were expecting a more urban type adventure, so their characters were built around the idea that you would have to be a bit subtle, maybe use smaller weapons that you could hide easily. And very quickly it turned into some sort of arms race against the aliens and the people that were roaming around that were still alive after the invasion. So my advice would be, if the surprise in itself was kind of fun, but at the same time, I think it would have been better if I talked to my players beforehand and said, look, I want to do an alien invasion and then a post-apocalyptic survival race in the cyberpunk setting. Is that okay with you guys? Yes or no? Well, luckily, my players are experienced and also very flexible, and we had a lot of fun with this game. Another role-playing game experience that I have with post-apocalyptic settings is Dark Sun. Now, Dark Sun, I originally came across it as a setting for 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and I do believe that versions have been made for 3rd edition of D&D, I think even 4th, and I know that there is a pretty interesting large group of people that is just waiting and chomping at the bits for a 5th edition D&D version of it. If you're interested in Dark Sun, there is a great Facebook group for it. I'll link in the show notes. And Dark Sun is a fantasy world that has experienced an apocalyptic event and has turned into a horrible desert where survival is very difficult. You are always going to be looking for water, looking for food, and looking for bits of technology from an age past when metal was still around. This setting was very refreshing to me as a player of Dungeons & Dragons, because I'd only really played in high fantasy settings, and all of a sudden I had completely new themes to play with. Survival was one that was very interesting. Also, just the aspect of what had destroyed the world, what was the apocalyptic event, and it had to do with magic, and then there was a way to use magic that was good for the environment, but also definitely a more powerful way that was very bad for the environment. And that really played into this theme of, hey man, don't make the world even worse. It's really a wonderful setting, very gritty, very dark, but also full of very interesting ideas about what would people do if the world is in such a state. Last week's guest, Sean Tompkin, created Iron Sworn, which is a role-playing game which also has to do with an apocalyptic event, which the people that play in this game are running from or have run from, and they've come to this new place where they need to try and survive. Other really cool role-playing games or setting books, etc., that you can check out would be, for instance, Mutant Year Zero, which we're going to be talking about with Tomas Härenstam. D-Genesis looks really, really interesting. I mean, check out their trailer on YouTube. Wow. There's Numenera, which is, I think, very popular at the moment, which is taking place in the distant future, and you're looking once again for artifacts from a better time, or a time that was at least more technologically advanced. And in general, I think the cool thing about post-apocalyptic role-playing is it can be done in pretty much any setting with any system. There are, of course, specific games out there, which I just mentioned, that are geared towards this subgenre, and they will have mechanics that support the themes of a post-apocalyptic world, such as survival, etc. But, as you've seen in my example earlier, you can use this theme in other genre games. It all depends on your creativity and the willingness of the players to perhaps forgo some of their class or race, etc. benefits. And you may need to introduce some house rules for important aspects of your apocalypse that the game doesn't support yet. And what I love most about post-apocalyptic fiction is that it often represents a very strong theme of hope and survival and a regrowth of the human species or whatever species you're playing amidst very grim circumstances. They're stories of survival, rebuilding, reflecting on past mistakes and avoiding them in the future, of community and relying on each other instead of being selfish. And I think that the most interesting and integral question you can ask yourself if you want to create a post-apocalyptic game in whatever system you choose is, what caused the apocalyptic event? What was the apocalyptic event? Once you figure that one out, all these other things that you want to think of, such as what are the dangers, what are the risks, what is missing, what are we looking for, how many people are there still, etc. All these kind of questions will be answered by that very first question. And once you figure that out, I think also the imagination will start to roll. I know that when I was researching this topic earlier today, when I was reading the different type of apocalypse events that I just told you about, already I could feel in the back of my mind things going like, ooh, oh yeah, oh yes, I could try that. Oh, that would be interesting. So for me, it's a very inspiring kind of topic. Guy Sklanders, who was also a guest on this show a couple of episodes ago, he is the host of the Great GM channel, and he has a wonderful video that kind of unpacks the post-apocalyptic genre for role-playing games a bit further and in a bit more detail than I'm doing now. So I suggest you check that out. I'll put a link, you guessed it, in the show notes. But for now, let's have a chat with Tomas Härenstam and see what he can tell us about the end of the world. So welcome to the show, Tomas Härenstam. Tomas is the co-founder and CEO of Fria Ligan Publishing. He started writing role-playing games at 12. Oh my God. A lifelong fan of the Swedish post-apocalyptic Mutant franchise, Tomas championed and designed Mutant Year Zero, a book that I have here right on my desk. And it's one of Fria Ligan's first real big hits, as well as the foundation for the award-winning Year Zero rules engine, which I will have some questions about later. And now it seems Fria Ligan is busier than ever. I'm seeing news about new Alien products, a Tales from the Loop board game, and a TV series, but I believe that's not yours, and Middle Earth as well. So I'm really delighted you could free up some time for us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I see you did your research there. Yes.
Yeah.
It's good to hear.
I try to do my homework. Yeah. So you guys are very busy. Many projects going on. What's the most exciting project you're working on right now?
Wow, that's hard. It's hard to sort of rank them. So because they're all really exciting. I mean, right now I'm working very much on the Destroyer of Worlds, which is the new cinematic scenario for Alien. So I'm sort of really knee deep in that. So that's really exciting at the moment. That's where my head is at primarily. But then, of course, also the Tales from the Loop board game. That's going. I'm involved as a project manager on that, but I'm not the designer of that game. So it's, but I'm still obviously involved, and it's a really cool project that I'm also excited about. So those two are mainly the main focus for me at the moment.
Okay, yeah. And this new adventure for Alien, I think, follows up on the previous one, right? The Chariots of the Gods.
That's right. It's not in the sense that you'll play the same characters, because they will most likely not all have survived the first scenario. So that's why the cinematics are built, that they come with pre-generated characters. So normally you wouldn't play the same characters in the next one. Maybe at some point, maybe you could, but that's not. Generally, you don't. But yes, it does continue the story in a sense. There are elements from Chariot that are carried on into Destroyer. So if you play them both, you'll pick up on some things that ring familiar and so on. So the overall plot carries on, even though the characters are different. Yeah.
Much like in the movies, I suppose, because I think Ripley is the only person to usually survive the whole thing.
Right. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, sounds very exciting. So today's podcast is mostly about post-apocalyptic role-playing games, and from what I understand, the Mutant franchise from Sweden started somewhere in '84. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The first edition came out in '84. Yeah, so a long time ago.
Yeah, and I mean, I was 5 at the time.
Yeah, I was 10.
Oh, right. Yeah. So what drew you to that particular game at the time?
Actually, I have no idea. I got it as a birthday present from my father when I was turned 11, so 85, and I had no idea what it was. I had never played an RPG before, so and I don't think he knew what it was either. So it was just one of these things that started to pop up because this was like the second RPG published in Sweden. It was a fantasy game first that came out like 2 years before, so it started to become a thing around mid 80s. So I think he just bought it as a birthday gift, not really knowing what it was. And then me and my brother started playing around with it and just went. And then I kind of discovered that whole world.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the starting point.
Wow. What a lucky gift.
Yeah, I guess so.
Especially for being so random. Like, oh, I guess he'll like this. There you go. Yeah.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. That's great. It kind of reminds me of my father at some point one summer saying to me, "Oh, you're bored? Well, try reading this." And he gave me The Hobbit. You know, it's like
right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They didn't know what they started.
Yeah. Well, now you're making a living off of it, right? So that's
it's pretty weird. Yeah.
Yeah. That's cool. And what makes post-apocalyptic role-playing games fun for you? Because it's very dark in general.
It is kind of dark, but I always found that so fascinating, that kind of premise of civilization collapsing and what comes after, because it's both, yes, it is that kind of apocalypse, but it's also what comes next, and that kind of thought experiment to me is super interesting because it has a lot to do with, I mean, it's a cool thing to play around in as a game, but it also raises some interesting questions about like what kind of world are we creating? Could it all look like if it was different, and what would that look like? It's just a super fascinating thought experiment to me. So it's kind of stayed with me for a long time.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And what would you say? Because for me, Mutant Year Zero was the first post-apocalyptic role-playing game that I'm going to try out. I mean, I have it here. I got it as a birthday gift.
Nice.
That sounds like a coincidence, but and I'm looking to start playing it this year sometime. So, what would you say makes a recipe for a good experience in a post-apocalyptic game?
That's a good question. I mean, at least from Mutant Year Zero and how that game is intended to be played, and I think that kind of is connected to the post-apocalyptic theme, is that I think it's a very open game. It's a sandbox game, and I think that's a key thing, because you need that kind of a blank slate type of game, at least for me, to get it. It works really well with a post-apocalyptic feeling, because it's like the world is an open slate, so it really transfers very well into having a game that also is sandboxy and open for players to explore. I mean, there should be plots and things to discover and so on, but I think a post-apocalyptic game should not be a linear story. I think there is some that would, in my mind, that would be a clash. So I think having this open world sandbox type game works really well for Mutant and other games in the genre.
Yeah, and the rules seem to really support the idea of exploration with going into the zone, etc. And that the zone is divided up into all these sectors that you can explore. Okay, so I should probably, most likely, I'm going to be the person running it, because that's always the case. So I should prepare mostly a good map, I suppose, and ideas for what could happen in those different areas.
Yeah. I mean, that's usually how I run it. You can basically run it with zero prep, just kind of roll dice and roll random encounters and just have, the game generate what happens. But then that will require you to roll with it and be pretty fast on your feet. And at least personally, my style, I want not to prep too much, but just a little bit of prep. So I have at least some ideas, maybe roll up a few sectors in advance and just have like something to go on, but not so much prep that it kind of locks you down into something you've decided to happen, but just keep it very light level of prep. Is the way I normally do it anyway.
Yeah. And so I haven't quite finished reading the book, but it hints at a meta plot about Eden, which we shouldn't spoil here, obviously, in the interview, in case people haven't played yet. How does that affect replayability? Let's say that I've played this with my group, and they've come to that point in the meta plot that they discover what's going on. What happens after that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the way the meta plot is designed is that you can draw that out pretty much as long as you want. You can get there to the end, so to speak, pretty quickly in just like, I don't know, 5 or 6 sessions maybe, or you can draw it out to 100 sessions. It's very much malleable in that sense. You can kind of use it as you want, and if you get there, there is definitely possible to keep playing after that point. There is, without, it's hard to go into detail without spoiling stuff, so it's possible that Eden can be an end point for the campaign, but it is also possible to continue playing. It will be a slightly different experience after that, but it's definitely possible. And we released just like a couple of months ago a campaign module called the Grey Death, and that continues basically after the main plot in the core book. So that's one thing to look at if you want to keep playing after having done that first main campaign. The Grey Death is a possibility to continue with.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah. Because that's the one thing that I was wondering about when I was reading. I thought, okay, because most role-playing games, they tell you, these are the mechanics, this is the setting, have fun, and here you can buy 20 million adventures. But this book, it kind of has its own adventure cooked into it. Well, adventure, I said, but so this meta plot. So it made me wonder, like,
Yeah, I mean, we have, for Mutant Year Zero, we have these expansions, but they're kind of sequel games. So they're actually full games in the same universe. You have GenLab Alpha, Mechatron, and Elysium. So there's 4 core books actually, and they take place in the same universe, but they are focused on different things. And each of them has its own like campaign meta plot in there. And so we've built this franchise a little bit differently, so that it's actually, when you get one of these books, you have like everything you need. You have the rules, you have the world, and you also have pretty much the story or the campaign to play in that one book. And then once that's done, it's kind of done. You can continue, but it's kind of a complete thing on its own. So you're right. We have constructed this game line a bit differently from what I guess is the normal way of doing things.
Yeah. And what made you make that choice? How did you come up with it?
Yeah, that's a long story, and it's a choice made long ago. So it's because we can. So no, it goes back to, because Mutant, like we mentioned at the beginning, Mutant started out as a Swedish game, one of the like 2 big ones in Sweden, and it's stayed that way for a pretty long time. And there were other versions of Mutant in the meantime before our version. And Mutant Year Zero was also first released in Sweden that same year, 2014, same year as the English version. But so it was originally actually designed for like a Swedish audience who was very familiar with Mutant, because that's one of the 2 big games in Sweden, basically. So we decided to, because in the old versions of Mutant, you had these different classes. You have the mutants, you have the mutant animals, you have the robots, you have the psionics, you have the robots. Well, you have like the different character classes. And all the previous games, you kind of mixed them all together, which was kind of fun. You got these bit crazy groups of the walking bear and the robot, and got that, which lent itself to a lot of fun stuff. But what we felt we wanted to do with Year Zero, because it's like a prequel game to the other versions, the earlier versions. The Year Zero it's like set at an earlier point in history, so it's a bit more post-apocalyptic, and it's so we wanted to go back to the origins. And with the way we decided to do that is to create pretty much one game for each character class. So that's in Mutant Year Zero. The first book is about the mutant humans. GenLab Alpha is about the mutant animals. Mechatron is about the robots, and Elysium is about the non-mutant humans. That's sort of the normal humans, so to speak. So that's actually kind of goes back to that. We decided to do this, like to explore each character class, their kind of backstory. So in each of these books, you kind of play the backstory of that character class. In GenLab Alpha, you get to know how the mutant animals were created, and you play their origin story. And basically, that's the way it goes for all of these four books.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's kind of how we thought it up in the beginning. So it's and then we would once we had locked in on that kind of way to do it, we kind of had to stick with it. So so and we decided when we did translated versions, we just kept that same thing. So that's kind of the background to why it looks that way.
Okay, yeah. And so for players of especially first-time players of a post-apocalyptic game, what do they need to do to have a good time? Like what's the buy-in, and what should be their aim?
I think it's kind of the same in a similar way. I mean, to the game as a whole, I think it's important that they feel. I mean, Mutant Year Zero is very much about exploring, but it's also about building something, because you have these rules for building the arc, the settlement that you're based in. And so I think that combination of exploring and developing and building, and that kind of gives players a lot of freedom to decide which direction to go. And I think sort of not being afraid of that, but instead leaning into it and kind of going all in and trying to sort of make the world their own, I think is the best way for players to go, and not sort of sitting and waiting for the adventure to come to them. They kind of have to reach out and go and do things rather than waiting for someone to give them a quest, because that's probably not going to happen.
No. In fact, if they do nothing, then their society will die out, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that actually drew me to the game initially, is that the concept of the arc. You instantly, as a player, you have something that you should care about, that you love, that you want to take care of, and also there's kind of like a mini game in the game, trying to make the best arc possible, and grow it and expand it, etc. I think if players really go for that, you get a very interesting kind of tension between, on the one hand, okay, we have to work on this arc, but on the other hand, we also have to get out there and
and you can kind of decide whether you want to put the focus, if you want to do a lot of arc play, and then it becomes kind of a bit of intrigue and stuff like that happening in the arc, or if you want to focus on going out into the zone. And that can be in the same campaign. You can have different phases where you focus on one or the other. So you have these two things to play around with. And what I've seen, I mean, a lot of groups have done over the years is actually to do a lot of maps of their arc and their own zone maps if they want to play in a zone that they create themselves. There's a lot of potential there to do a lot of like homebrew stuff. It's really built to be homebrewed, this game.
I found a wonderful tutorial on YouTube the other day on how to create these zone maps out of Google Maps, actually. So you can and that's great fun. So I made a post-apocalyptic map of my birth city, where most of my friends live, and
nice.
Oh, what's going on?
That's great.
Good fun. And so it's interesting to me that the second ever role-playing game published in Sweden, and that's super popular, is a post-apocalyptic game. Does that say something about Sweden or the Swedish role-playing community? Or
that's a very good question. Hard to say. I think, at that time, that was the Cold War, so I think that kind of nuclear holocaust thing was pretty much on everyone's mind to some extent. It was very much a current issue on people's minds. I think maybe another part is that I know at that time the company who did published these games at the time, the first game was a fantasy game, which kind of makes sense. But then I think they looked a lot, even though these games were quite different from Dungeons and Dragons in terms of mechanics, they still followed. I think they looked pretty much at the theme, and I think they looked at first at Dungeons and Dragons, and then the other one they looked at was Gamma World. I think Mutant kind of started out as an adaptation of Gamma World. Then it got its own life and became a very different thing. But I think that's, at the time, I think was the inspiration also for making this game. As to why it became their second game, I really couldn't tell you, but it's the way it turned out.
Yeah. And do you feel that there's any difference between European role-playing games and American ones?
I think so, to some extent, or at least, there are so many different games in the US that you can you can find all kinds of games there. But if you look at the big ones, like, obviously Dungeons and Dragons as the reference point, I think traditionally European games, or at least Swedish games, have tended to be a bit less heroic, a bit less focused on only kind of killing monsters and leveling up, and a bit more focused on simulation or immersion. So I think there's a difference there. But I mean, so it's a matter of degrees. I mean, all games have all of these things. But I mean, if to compare, I think the trend, or at least even more back then in the 80s, because the Swedish games were based on basic role-playing, the same system that is used in Call of Cthulhu and RuneQuest. It's a percentile system. Has more of a simulationist, low-level feel as compared to Dungeons & Dragons with its leveling and fast progression, and that it's a very different kind of feel of the gameplay. So the difference was very distinct back then. Now it's a bit more mixed up. You can get all kinds of games in any country, but there is a tradition there that I think still remains to some extent.
Yeah, and maybe it's partially to do with culture also. That American culture enjoys heroes very much. If you look at comics, etc. European culture maybe a bit less. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Because I heard similar things about live action role play, that Nordic LARP, as they call it, often can be super realistic, even an exercise of, okay, we are now the European committee and we have a pandemic. What do we do? And that can be a game. Although obviously you make light of the current situation, but
no, but you're right. There is definitely a tradition of LARP. Nordic LARP is like a thing of its own. I'm not a big LARper, so I don't know don't know that much about it, but I know of it, and it's those games can be very much, serious games, and serious. I mean, it's not kind of heroic running around with swords, although we do that too. But I mean, there is this type of game of kind of serious, down to earth, social realism LARPing in the Nordic countries. It's just I don't know what it says about Europe or Scandinavia, but anyway.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And so D&D uses the D20, a very, I would say, the most famous role-playing dice ever. And then we have the D100 system, which you just mentioned. But Mutant Year Zero uses D6 dice pools. What made you go for that?
It's a good question. I've been playing around with game systems for as long as I can remember. It's been kind of a hobby since I was, like you mentioned, 12. And as I think, as in all of these cases, you sort of just start modifying the systems that are in existing games and trying out, tweaking them, and then then kind of testing different things, and then that evolves into a system on its own. I think so. I've been playing around with game systems of different kinds since forever, and I think I've been doing mostly, the games that I've been designing the rules for, the Year Zero games primarily, but also a couple of other games before that. I kind of like the simplicity of, I want rule systems that don't get in the way of the story, but at the same time kind of enhance the theme of the story, but without kind of blocking flow. So that's kind of where I'm always trying to find a way to do that. And to my experience, I think dice pool systems, I think one thing is that slow play down is doing a lot of math in the middle of like playing the game.
Yeah.
And having a dice pool system, so having a dice pool system where you just add, subtract dice is a very simple, fast way of doing modifications. And there was also some bonuses, I think, in terms of you can never reach 100% success chance with the dice pool, for example. I mean, you can just add more dice, but it will never hit like 100%. So it also has some, I think, benefits in terms of how it scales that I like. Yeah. So there's a couple of different things that led me down that route. And I think also another thing I like about it is it's an easier way to measure margins of success. In a percentile system, you have to, I beat the roll by this much, and then I get this bonus. But it's a clunkier way of doing it than just I rolled 3 6s instead of one is enough to succeed, but then the extra 6s give extra effects. It's an easy way of leveling success also. So it's got some benefits that I that I like, and that's why I went that way. And now it's kind of became a house system for us. It's not that I hate all other systems or think they're all crap. It's just that this is the one we focused on and developed and ended up with, and now that's the one we're focusing on. So I guess that's the story behind that.
Yeah, and so you say the dice should also kind of support the theme of the game, and in your case, well, in Free League's case, that's literal also, because a lot of these games have their own unique dice. So Mutant Year Zero has one with a biohazard and what's it, nuclear or something symbols on them. They're hard to get, these dice.
Yeah, actually, they have been. Yeah, I think we actually made a new batch now, so they should be around. But they have been a bit hard to get. You're right.
Yeah, especially so there's, I think, two versions. There's the old ones, the original ones, and then there's a newer version.
Now we actually made a third version. That's not great to do that, but it's the way it turned out. So now we're happy with. The final version that we have now, I think it's on the website. We're happy about that. So, we have having some problems shipping out because of the pandemic, but now things seem to be opening up again. So I think they should be available there if nowhere else.
That's great. Yeah, because I was looking around a few months ago when I got the book, and I want these special dice because dice, and also it does something, I think, to the feeling at the table when you roll dice and a couple of biohazard signs show up.
It definitely gives you. So it's a very concrete way to kind of push the theme, and also of course in the way that dice actually interact rules wise. But you can play the game with normal dice. It's perfectly doable. So you don't need those special custom dice, but they do help, I think, and they're a nice touch.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, and it's the same with Alien. I saw dice there with these little face huggers on them, and that's just great. Yeah. So we're getting close to already to the end of this interview. There were so many things that I wanted to ask you, but maybe let's focus on one more thing before we get to the last question. So art, I think, plays a huge role in your perception of a game when you buy it or when you intend to buy it. And I think that's especially true for the games that you guys produce. Because if I look at these games, they all have a very evocative style of art. And in fact, when we talk about Tales of the Loop, for instance, that started as an art book, just right?
That's true. Yeah. So, you're right. I think the art and graphic design has always been a thing for us. It's not more important than the text or the content, but for us, they really supplement each other. And I think both are needed for, at least for me personally, to get excited about a game. That's the way I work. Even though if the text is amazing, but there is no art to draw me in, that's going to be an obstacle for me. And of course, the other way around doesn't help either. If it's just great art, but no game there, that wouldn't do it. But I really want both, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And so the art in Mutant Year Zero, of course, it reflects this post-apocalyptic theme. It's all very dark and grimy, etc. So how did you come to the to the design, for instance, of the front here of the book? So I have it here in front of me. It's a bit hard to see because of this green screen.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So these three characters. So were they characters in a particular game, or how did you get to that particular image?
It's an interesting. That piece of art has a bit of history. This is the art for the international edition. The Swedish one has a different cover, and this piece of art, it's actually a street in London. I can't remember, but it's just in the center of London. I just don't know the name of the street at the moment, but it's there. And we wanted to kind of emphasize that this edition was sort of set not in Sweden, so that's what we chose as London Street.
Yeah.
But the characters as such, I think the two on the sides, the guy, the woman and the guy in the helmet, I think those are creations of the illustrator, a guy called Ola Larsson, who's really great artist who did this piece. He did the whole piece, obviously, but the guy in the center, that's actually based on a character in a trailer that was made for the game. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's a pretty cool CGI trailer that some friends of mine made. And that in itself is actually based on an art piece inside the book. I think it's in chapter, the characters chapter, like chapter 2. There is a guy with like moth wings or something. And that was kind of adapted in the trailer into this guy with the fly wings instead. So it's kind of mutated into that. So yeah.
Oh, wow. Now that you mention London, actually, I see there the black cabs and...
Yeah. So there's that. Wow. So no, it's always like that. I mean, for the post-apocalyptic games, it's always a play with. I mean, it's dark, obviously, but it can't only be dark because it would just not be interesting. So you need some contrast to the darkness, and that can be with, some levels of humor and also in the interior art, which it's a line art kind of comic book style art in Mutant Year Zero, and I think it creates a nice contrast between kind of the dark themes and because you get. So I think it kind of works in a nice way, because you need some kind of contrast against just the bleakness and the darkness that's definitely there, but then some humor or something to contrast it against. Yeah.
I also see snippets of that kind of mildly dark humor in some of the text. I wish I could quote it right now, but I was reading a rule just before the interview, and it hinted at like if you fail, well, I don't remember what it was, but if I can find it back, I'll probably put it in post.
Sure.
So one last question then, before you get back to your busy day. And that is a question I ask every one of my RPG heroes, which is, who is your personal hero when it comes to role-playing games?
That is a good question. I mean, there's so many of them, but I mean, at least I think one guy I should mention, I think, is his name is Nils Gullikson, and he is an iconic RPG artist he illustrated both of these games that I mentioned, the Swedish 80s games, the fantasy one, Drakar och Demoner, and Mutant, the first versions, and he's got a very special kind of style that's really iconic in Sweden, and I think without his art, I don't think I've been as captivated as I became with these kinds of games. And we actually made a game based on it started out as a game based on his art, which is Forbidden Lands. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So actually, so that started out as doing so that's a fantasy game, and it's kind of our tribute to him and his art. So that game is actually has a lot of his old 80s art in it, but also new art by him and by some others. So that's kind of that whole game, which is also a post-apocalyptic game, but in a fantasy setting. But it's very much like it works in a very similar way to Mutant Year Zero. It's also a sort of map crawl exploration type game, but it's a fantasy game instead of post-apocalyptic. And that's art-wise, the whole art style, the black and white, the line art thing, kind of old school feel to it. It's very much the way he did it back then, and that kind of a tribute to him. So so that makes sense. I'll pick him then among all of these great other creators that have sort of inspired me through the years.
Most of my guests find this a very hard question to answer, because like you say, there are so many cool people that make cool things for who do you pick? And also, what does that mean then to all the other ones?
Exactly.
I mean, not that they're all listening to this show. I mean, geez, I wish, but
no, but you're right.
Yeah, and it ties in very nicely with our discussion about art. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Tomas, today. And I have more burning questions, but we'll reserve those for maybe a second interview at some other time.
Absolutely. I'll be happy to come back on anytime.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Well, that was another wonderful interview. Thank you so much for all your insights, Tomas. So what I take away from all this is that post-apocalyptic fiction is dark, but it's also a very interesting thought experiment about what could happen to human society once we lose our technology and our relatively hospitable living conditions on Earth. And like I said at the beginning, it carries a theme of hope. And post-apocalyptic games work very well in a sandbox open-world environment, because the world itself has kind of been blown open, or at least been changed very drastically, and it needs to be explored. It allows the players also to explore questions such as what actually happened? How are we going to survive and overcome this? How are we going to regrow our society? How has the world changed, and what dangers and risks lurk in the dark? And that makes, I think, for wonderful, very interesting and gripping gameplay. And what I found interesting as well is that I never really gave much thought to dice pools, but from what I understand now, these D6 dice pools have some advantages to them, such as they are quick and easy to interpret, especially if you have these dice that show the symbols. That really helps. And they have a more realistic or less heroic kind of curve of success to them, and they allow for partial successes, which is a very different experience from, let's say, a D100 or D20 system. Well, I know for sure that I'm going to be playing this Mutant Year Zero game, and lately, because I was looking into this topic, I've been getting very, very enthusiastic about all these themes that post-apocalyptic gaming carries with it. So hopefully my campaign will go well, and I can maybe report to my patrons, because that's one of the things I do on Patreon. For certain levels, I share details of the campaigns that I run in a monthly document. So, are you planning to play some post-apocalyptic RPGs, or have you played them and really enjoyed them? Let me know. Get in touch on Twitter or on Facebook, and let us know how all this stuff went or what you're planning to do. Well, that's it for episode 10. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording. If you did, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps to get the podcast get heard. Want to keep up with the latest news about my podcast? Well, then hop on over to Twitter at RPGHeroes1. Check out the full show notes with all the links at rpgheroes.buzzsprout.com. Want to support the show and join other supporters on my Discord channel? Then I would be honored if you check out my completely renewed Patreon page at patreon.com/rpgheroes. 2 weeks from now, I'm talking to John Harper, creator of Blades in the Dark, about low-prep sandbox role-playing games. Until then, stay heroic.